Welcome back. It's D-Day in the U.S. as Americans cast their votes to choose the next president. The contest between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is extremely tight, with the latest polls indicating a dead heat. Both campaigns are fighting fiercely for critical swing states where every vote counts. And joining me now with analysis on the election is retired U.S. diplomat and associate editor at the Daily Maverick, Brooks Spector. Thank you so much for your time, Brooks. Now, looking at the journey leading up to the elections, just how close is that race between Trump and Kamala Harris? And did it change when Joe Biden bowed out?
Okay, well, let's take the last part first. Joe Biden had a very bad debate against Donald Trump, in which his age looked it looked worse than his age actually was, and it took a week or so for him to read the tea leaves, and ultimately, between his wife, presumably, and Nancy Pelosi, senior congresswoman from California, he took their advice and their encouragement and decided that best to preserve his legacy rather than engage in a grueling campaign in which it would become more and more difficult rather than less so. Not the least of which because he would be then, if he won, he would be 4 years older and in even more difficult circumstances. When Kamala Harris stepped in, as she's the vice president, and the attention of Democrats shifted to her almost immediately, she got a noticeable bump out of a very vigorous and effective nominating convention, and a good speech. And it looked, at least initially, that she had a rise in expectations as well as support that might well sustain her through to the election day. She then had a good debate against Donald Trump, and you can say, though, that the numbers began to recede, so that it was back again to a real horse race between the two. One of the things that we should be very careful about in looking at polling is to assume that the polls are predictive as opposed to simply snapshots. And if you're statistically minded, as probably many of your viewers are, they know that a poll has a margin of error, no matter how well it's conducted, usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 3% either way, and a coefficient of reliability somewhere about 95% if it's a good poll. That means 95% of the time it's accurate, but 5% of the time it may not be. And that 3% margin of error could kick in rather dramatic ways. The key to this now is not the polling, but the actual turnout, people showing up to vote, because that's the ultimate arbiter. And the footnote to that, as I keep reminding people, is that many millions of people have already voted by advanced balloting or mail-in ballots. Somewhere close to half the population may have used, by the time that officially has been calculated, may have used those facilities, and that is an enormously different set of circumstances than just a decade ago. COVID had a lot to do with this. People were not real keen in standing in lines for hours on end next to a whole bunch of people they didn't know. Advanced balloting, fill in your ballot, drop it off, and go away, that appealed to a lot of people. And so that has happened. And in some states, everybody votes that way now. So this is a very different kind of process. You get to what they call the swing states, the Pennsylvanias, the Michigans, the Wisconsins, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada. What you're dealing with are states in which the opinion appears to be, again, 50-50 or close to it. And in fact, if you look at some states like Pennsylvania, two big cities, Pittsburgh on the one side and Philadelphia on the other, they're reliably Democratic. The space in between is small towns, rural areas, which has traditionally been Republican. But then there are the rings of suburban areas around these two big cities in which there are lots of votes, in which there are a lot of well-educated women, many of whom have professional occupations, who in a generation before that might well have been Republicans, but now are moving directly toward the Democrats. The gender split
Hmm.
Uh, for Kamala Harris is she has a vast, overwhelming lead in the polling, at least the attitude surveys, among women, whereas Trump has presumably had a large majority or support among young, white, not college educated men. So these two very different approaches have led to a very different kind of campaigning. So some of the vulgarities of the Trump campaign and the scatological references and the uh, the bad boy behavior,
Yeah.
which if they were your 15-year-old child, you'd send them to the room without supper,
Mm.
kind of behavior, presumably appeals to that sector of the population, whereas Harris has been appealing to those women that we're talking about, saying, it's my job to bring the country together. No more nasty fighting at the dinner table.
Yeah.
We're going to sort these problems out. So there's a sort of psychodynamics that's taking place in the middle of all this. So
Mm.
if you really wanted to know what was going on and how it was going to come out, you'd spend time trying to figure out what the votes were like in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is the 50% county in a state that is 50%, 50%. It's relatively affluent,
Yeah.
better educated than much of the country, a lot of professional people, decidedly suburban, and just a couple of small little cities in it,
Yeah.
but it's part of the greater Philadelphia area. So that's what I'm going to watch as soon as that data is available,
Okay.
places like that.
All right. Well, thank you for painting that picture for us. But also, I know that the population is not just voting for the next president, they're also choosing members of Congress. What do the mechanics of that look like?
Well, when you go in to vote, you see a ballot which says for president and vice president, pick A, pick B. But your district, your congressional
Mm-hmm.
district, you get a choice of congressman or running for congressperson A or B, or sometimes even A, B, and C occasionally, and you get to pick there. There's no requirement that you vote straight party. And in some cases, you'll be voting for a Senate seat.
Mm.
You may well be voting for a governorship. You almost certainly will be voting for state legislators, maybe a mayor, perhaps even city council members. So the ballot will have the length in many cases. Do you remember the ballot in 1994 that was it was sort of like a meter long
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
with I don't
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
20
Mm-hmm.
different parties on it.
Mm.
Well, that ballot in the US will have something of the same length of it because there are a lot of choices. The other
Okay.
thing to keep in mind that will focus attention on for a lot of people in 10 states, there are going to be referendums about state restrictions on the women's reproductive rights issue. And that's important too. And that may kick people back into thinking about who they should pick for president. Now,
Okay.
you asked earlier, what are the main issues that are generating the contestation?
Mm-hmm.
We can tick them off. The first one is the question of immigration, which Donald Trump has turned into a real bête noire of, they're coming to steal your jobs and your
Yeah.
homes and to rape and pillage and eat your pets and, the whole range of grim possibilities.
Yeah.
Um, the second issue is the economy. And other things being equal, economic concerns, what they call kitchen table issues, are always the thing that motivate people. And that's, I think, is a universal constant worldwide.
Mm.
You worry most about whether you can feed your family, whether or not you can pay off your bills, whether or not you can buy a house or rent an apartment or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Um, the third issue is women's reproductive rights, which the Harris campaign has really elevated to a sense of concern. And the fourth is something that the Harris campaign has been pushing hard, which is protection of democracy, democratic values. And by implication, Donald Trump is the destroyer of democratic values and institutions. So those are the key issues.
Mm.
Much further down the list, when you look at the survey data, are things like uh, climate
Yes.
change
Yes.
and environmental protection. And then further down, even beyond that, are what we tend to think of, and I think wrongly, are the major foreign policy issues that are motivating most voters. War in Ukraine, and then the Middle East crisis. The reason why these are lower down on the list is because there are no American personnel involved. You don't have divisions of American troops on site fighting actively. There's obviously the possibility that might happen in the Middle East, although seemingly not at this point. And the Trump campaign has been very strong about saying, I can solve the Ukraine-Russia war in an afternoon, 2 phone calls, and it's done. There won't be any American involvement. We'll save money, and that'll be the end of that. Who knows what he means by that or how he's planning to do it? I have no clue. There's never been a plan. And the same, in fact, has been said by him, roughly speaking, for the Middle East. But that runs congruently with his almost total support for the Israeli prime minister in all ways, shapes, and sizes. Harris, by contrast, has, as I said, made a statement of support, but also an understanding that there's another side to that conflict, and that we need to pay much more attention to that. And she has, in essence, said that environmental and climate change issues, like all other international activities that involve us all, must be given some priority. Now, the other thing which I didn't list in that litany is one of the Trump positions, which is that he will punish China and other offending exporters to the U.S. with a major increase in tariffs. Now, it seems to me that Donald Trump resolutely refused to understand that a tariff is effectively a sales tax on the citizens in the U.S. I don't know why he refuses that. Economists have tried to explain this to him for years, but he insists not. And now, as far as Africa goes, or South Africa, I'm preempting your next question, I think. The things that are, I wouldn't say at risk, but at least subject to some concern, is the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is not a treaty, it's U.S. law. And it allows thousands of products from Africa duty-free entry into the United States. How that would work with Donald Trump's tariff, I honestly don't know. But it's due to expire next year, and that means it either has to be reinitiated or revised or simply let not happen.
Well, Brooks,
now, if that
we will be discussing this and more, of course, during the week, and also considering where the vote turns, where the pendulum swings. But thank you so much. We have really covered a lot ahead of the result of that election. Really, really appreciate your time and your insights today. We do have to wrap up the conversation there. That was retired U.S. diplomat and associate editor at the Daily Maverick, Brooks Spector.